Glisgiss, a narrated Bionicle MOC profile. Overview. Glisgiss was a male biosynth and a member of the Bistin species. Born on the island of Glisgiss, Glisgiss would leave to start a new life in the Scatten Island. There he would work as a mechanic and mercenary, transforming himself through physical modifications into a formidable warrior. With a collection of natural and augmented powers and weapons, Glisgiss could hold his own in battle against multiple opponents. He was feared by many as a mysterious and reclusive creature of gruesome power. Summarized biography. Glisgiss represented an extremely rare variant of the Bistin species, a type of Bistin known as a king Bistin. The Bistin were native to the remote island of Glisgiss, and most were little more than feral animals. King Bistin, however, were the result of a rare mutation in Bistin that caused those affected to stand upright, lose their wings, develop hardened carapaces, and possess brains with the intelligences of sapient species. King Bistin, however, also suffered from infertility, and thus could not reproduce their ranks into a viable species separate from their lesser cousins. Scientists from the Scatten Islands routinely made trips to Glisgiss to study the Bistin. Stories of the upright-standing King Bistin were well known, and Scatten scientists returned to the island often in search of specimens. On one such trip, a group of Scatten scientists encountered Glisgiss, who, like most King Bistin, was living alone and alienated from the lesser Bistin. The scientists surrounded Glisgiss in an attempt to sedate and capture him for study, but Glisgiss fought back. The scientists were unprepared for the brute strength and intelligence of the King Bistin, and Glisgiss made short work of the entire team. He tracked the scientists' trail back to their beached vessel, and Glisgiss began living near the ship. After months of studying it, he slowly began to learn how to control it, and he eventually used it to sail off Glisgiss. During his time on the ship, he became well versed in fixing and maintaining machinery. He learned navigational charts on board the ship, and used them to sail to the Scatten Islands. Once he arrived, he disembarked and began learning the ways of the islanders. Although few on the islands had ever seen a Bistin before, most did not trouble Glisgiss, as they were used to the plethora of sapient species living on the island. During this time, Glisgiss learned the dominant language Scattans, and with this began searching for a means to support himself beyond hunting. He used the skills he acquired on board his ship to become a mechanic, repairing machines in exchange for food or shelter. With the coming of the Scatten Wars, Glisgiss soon found work repairing the war machines of combatant nations and rogue warlords. Glisgiss became increasingly concerned that war would creep onto the islands he was working on. His exposure to machinery and the threat of war gave Glisgiss the idea to mechanically augment his own body with hardware that could aid him in combat. With money earned from completed contracts, he began purchasing equipment to begin a process of self-augmentation. When this was completed, Glisgiss had transformed himself into a powerful fighter with a variety of unique powers. As he predicted, war spread to his island. Glisgiss offered his services as a starved gun mercenary, fighting for whatever faction paid the most. Enemies and allies alike had never before seen a King Bistin in combat, and Glisgiss would quickly prove himself a relentless combatant. Personality. Glisgiss's personality, like his life story, was something of an enigma. As a King Bistin, unable to assimilate into lesser Bistin society, Glisgiss developed a proclivity for solitude at an early age. His infertility made him asexual and unconcerned with searching for mates. This further developed his solitary nature. Even after acquiring some command of the Scattan's language, Glisgiss still was short to speak. He generally only spoke in situations where speaking was unavoidable, such as searching for work or contracts. he had extreme difficulty socializing with other sapient species living on the Scatten Island, as many were unnerved by his alien presence and reclusive nature. But this seemed to suit Glisgiss well. Powers and abilities. Many of Glisgiss's powers and abilities came from his very biology as a king biston and biosynth. As a member of the biston species, Glisgiss's senses were excellent and served him well in combat. His large compound eyes could track the movement of an opponent effectively, and often allowed Glisgiss to counterattack before the enemy was ready. His sensitive antennae could detect faraway disturbances in the air, and this frequently alerted Glisgiss to would-be ambushers well before they attacked. Additionally, Glisgiss retained the strong grip of biston feet, allowing him to stick to surfaces he walked or climbed. This meant that Glisgiss rarely stumbled or fell during a brawl, and could easily climb vertical surfaces. Some of Glisgiss's attributes came from being born a king biston rather than a typical biston. King biston were distinguishable from their lesser counterparts in their size, upright stances, lack of wings, and carapace armor. These carapaces helped king biston survive in extreme environments and temperatures, and Glisgiss improved upon this through augmentation. At the height of his modifications, Glisgiss's torso and arms had been outfitted with a large pumping apparatus. One function of this apparatus was in its ability to turn a portion of nutrients acquired from food into specialized chemical stimulants. These stimulants would then be pumped into key areas in his flesh, engorging his muscles and strengthening his carapace. This not only made Glisgiss especially resistant to environmental extremes, but also provided excellent protection from physical trauma and damage in combat. Weapons. As with many of his own abilities, Glisgiss's weapons were an extension of his own biston biology. All bistons suffered from weak stomachs that struggled with digestion. To solve this, biston evolved two glands in their jaws which could secrete a caustic acid. Biston were predatory hunters, often stalking prey for hours before striking. When they did, they would leap onto a target and dig their powerful mandibles into the target's flesh. They would then begin secreting the acid, allowing it to dissolve the target's body. After a few minutes, most of the target's carcass would be turned into an easily digestible paste. Biston would then suck this paste and complete digestion processes in their stomachs. Glisgiss effectively weaponized his acid glands. The network of pumps throughout Glisgiss's body not only sent chemical stimulants into his muscles, but also into his acid-producing glands. Injected with the stimulants his body produced, Glisgiss's jaw glands bulged in size, producing a more corrosive acid at nearly 3 times the volume of natural biston. Additional pumps were hooked into these engorged acid-producing glands, and ran all the way down to his arm-mounted blades. These blades were designed to channel Glisgiss's acid, and could fire it in long streams at opponents. From range, these streams of highly corrosive acid could burn holes in walls or obstacles. Sustained fire often brought down entire walls, and could expose enemies using the walls for cover. Fired from range at an enemy, Glisgiss's acid could eat through armor and stun enemies from a distance. At close range, these blades could be driven into an opponent, bringing the acid from Glisgiss's mouth directly into the body of a target, and dissolving them from the inside. Glisgiss's blades were also capable of absorbing the paste made from his enhanced biston acid. This extensive modification to Glisgiss's body essentially turned his blades into additional mouths through which he could consume enemy flesh. Weaknesses. Despite his strengths in hand-to-hand combat, Glisgiss suffered from weaknesses that, when exploited by opponents, could cripple him in battle. As with his powers, Glisgiss's weaknesses were attributable to his biston nature. Glisgiss's blades were such a linchpin of his fighting strategies that any failure in their operation could dangerously lessen his combat performance. Although Glisgiss kept his acid glands constantly bloated with stimulants to produce acid in higher quantities, it was still possible for him to fire all of his acid before his body could replenish. This meant that over the course of long battles, Glisgiss often risked having nothing to fire at his opponents if he did not conserve his acid. When used up entirely, Glisgiss's acid could take an entire day to fully replenish, and during this time he was a significantly weaker combatant. In addition to this handicap on his weapons, Glisgiss could do nothing to improve the naturally poor digestive system that all Bistin were born with. As a biosynth, Glisgiss required food to live, and he often ate the dissolved bodies of animals or enemies he had killed. Generally, after consuming a large amount of food, Bistin would enter a long period of lethargy, as their body's strength would be focused entirely on processing nutrients. This made them slower and less alert, and a Bistin could remain in this state for an entire day. Glisgiss generally overcame this by always eating alone and in secret. When he was in his digestive lethargy, he would often go into retreat and not inform any companions of his state. In combat, if Glisgiss needed to consume enemy flesh, he would only do so when all of his foes were vanquished. Glisgiss nevertheless would have enormous difficulty fighting at his prime in such a state, and an enemy ambush during a digestive phase could prove fatal for Glisgiss. Glisgiss was well aware of these weaknesses, and did all in his power to prevent knowledge of them from reaching his enemy. Summary. Glisgiss was a menacing presence. His life was a testament to his intelligence and ambition, going from a lowly animal to a vicious fighter in the Scaton Wars. Though he had unavoidable weaknesses, he was a tenacious combatant who could receive punishment from multiple enemies and respond with lightning reflexes and crippling attacks. He may well have been the most powerful Bistin